Good evening. It is approximately 9:25. It's August 23rd, 2019, and this video is being recorded in the community room of my apartment complex in East Hampton, Massachusetts. Now, what you see in front of you is from an old 1998 wall chart cover book of a replica blueprint of the Titanic in front of you. And the reason why this blueprint is in front of me and in front of you on the camera is so I can better explain the situations about lifeboats aboard the Titanic. Because it's kind of hard sometimes to explain the lifeboat situation without having a visual aid. I like doing these videos because I like talking off the cuff and trying to test my own knowledge about Titanic history, at least being able to get the basic facts right of Titanic history. So we're going to go back and we're going to start back in the 1880s and 1890s because that's where the situation involving Titanic's lifeboat situation really begins. So in the 1880s and 1890s, the British Board of Trade, which is kind of equivalent to our Transportation Safety Board in the United States, created a regulation that required any ship that weighed 10,000 tons and over, any ocean liner that weighed 10,000 tons and over, to carry lifeboats for approximately 990 people. So that came out to about 14 various lifeboats of 30 feet to 40 feet in length, and they weighed about 5 tons. And how they came up with that regulation was based on cubic feet. It was not based on the amount of people that an ocean liner, such as the Oceanic of 1898 or the Adriatic of 1907, was designed to carry. It was based on cubic feet. And the reasoning behind that is because if you look here, and we're actually towards where the aft end of the Titanic on the starboard side, and we're looking at lifeboat number 9 here. These lifeboats were very, very difficult to lower. They were extremely heavy. I mean, we're talking about the size of basically a 30-foot minibus. And, you know, the logical thinking that the British Board of Trade had and the maritime world had was that if a modern ocean liner gets into an accident at sea, and the worst thing they could imagine was a major collision, or maybe crashing into an iceberg head on, or possibly running aground in harbor. If a ship got into an accident, the lifeboats could be utilized to transfer passengers from one ship to another. So if, for example, you're on a damaged ocean liner, for example, that's sinking, and you're able to call for assistance via wireless, which was coming around about the 1890s, early 1900s, or distress signals by Morse lamb or rockets or whatever, you as a passenger as well as a crew member could be transferred from that damaged ship over to the rescue ship that was coming. And in most cases prior to, these lifeboat regulations, if a ship was in a situation, if it was in a terrible situation where it was about to founder, most of the time the ship was lost and all the passengers and crew was lost. So there was no guarantee that even if there weren't enough lifeboats for people prior to the 1890s and prior to the 1990s, that anyone was going to be rescued anyway, unless it just happened to be that another ocean liner was crossing where your ship was sinking. So, we move forward from the 1890s. And before we move forward from the 1890s, I also want to say, too, that British Parliament had debates about this. And they said in 1894, I believe, I forget which member of Parliament said this, but in 1894, a member of Parliament said that it's unnecessary to have enough lifeboats for every single person. We're not going to be able to get every single person off of these large ocean liners anyway. And the logical thinking from this member of Parliament was that the ships are so watertight. And the British Board of Trade, I believe, created different specifications for watertight subdivision. And if a ship met that watertight subdivision requirement, based on the British Board of Trade regulations, they didn't have to even have as many lifeboats as was required, actually, if I'm getting this correct, because of their complex water type subdivision system that was created on these ocean liners. So we move forward to 1911, 1912, and we're in Titanic's time now. The Lusitania and Mauretania have just been built about 4 or 5 years prior to 1911. And these ships were the largest ocean liners in the world, the fastest ocean liners in the world, weighing in at a total of 32,000 gross tonnage, extremely fast and extremely modern. And the British Board of Trade decided, specifically because of the Olympic and Titanic and Britannic that were being built, they decided to review their British Board of Trade regulations that they had passed in the 1890s regarding the lifeboat situation. And they investigated the situation. They reviewed their policies. They reviewed their regulations. But they came to the conclusion that because the Olympic and the Titanic and the Britannic, and I'm pretty sure the Lusitania and Mauretania also influenced their decision to review the Board of Trade regulations, they decided that there was no need to increase the lifeboat tonnage, to increase the lifeboat capacity. There was no need to increase the lifeboat capacity. There was no need to increase the cubic feet because of Titanic's integral watertight compartment system that was designed for the Olympic class ocean liners. Now, the White Star Line was preparing for the fact that the British Board of Trade might update their regulations. And I'm just going to move forward here. They were very much prepared for the fact that the British Board of Trade might update their regulations. And so what they did was they decided to create these new special type winch type davits. And we're looking at a lifeboat here. What lifeboat are we looking at here? We're looking at lifeboat number 3, 5. Okay, we're looking at lifeboat number 5 here. So if we look at lifeboat number 5 here, we can see this is not the best blueprint in the world, but I'm just going to use this as an example. We can see that the winch type davits. Now these davits were very different from the rotary type davits that were on most ocean liners, including the Lusitania, Mauretania, the Adriatic, and any other ocean liners from the Western world. And these winch type davits were made stronger, and they were also designed to be able to carry a full load of passengers because they were tested with 70 people in them. Well, 70 men in them of various sizes. And these davits were designed to carry 2 lifeboats. So one lifeboat on the outside and then another lifeboat next to that lifeboat on the inside on the boat deck. And so when this lifeboat was lowered down with passengers, they would bring the foils and the rigging back up by an electrical system. They would crank the winch type davits back in, put the foils onto the lifeboat that was inside of the boat deck, make it level with the boat deck, crank it out, make it level with the boat deck, fill passengers in, and lower it away. Now the Titanic, because the Olympic and Titanic, because of the possibility of the British Board of Trade regulations, had originally decided to have 64 lifeboats, which would have exceeded all of the regulations by at least 2 times the amount. But then they lowered that down to 48. They lowered it down to 32. They finally went down to the original 990 lifeboat capacity with 14 lifeboats. The Titanic's lifeboat capacity was increased by about 4 or 6 extra lifeboats, which increased Titanic's lifeboat capacity to 1,178 people, or about 20 lifeboats. I also want to point out, too, that there's been recent evidence that was conducted by a Titanic historian that said the Titanic also actually exceeded her lifeboat regulations because during the maiden voyage of the Olympic in 1911, Thomas Andrews and Harland and Wolff designers had learned that there were a couple of things that were not exactly right with the Olympic as far as providing the utmost luxury for passengers. And they also discovered too that there was just things on the Olympic that didn't need to be on the Olympic. There was all this extra space that was being wasted on the Olympic. And so they decided to make some modifications to the Olympic, and they decided to incorporate all of these modifications and more onto the Titanic, which increased her total gross tonnage by 1,001 gross tons, which made Titanic on paper in 1912, April 10th, 1912, to be the largest ocean liner in the world. But because of what they had learned from the Olympic, and they had incorporated that into the Titanic, they actually had to lower her passenger capacity. They lowered her passenger capacity, which in turn, because they lowered her passenger capacity by maybe 200 to 500 people, or I'm not sure the exact numbers, but I know her lifeboat capacity, I know her passenger capacity, her total carrying passenger capacity was lowered by about maybe 100 to 300 people. And because of that, that made Titanic's lifeboat capacity increased because her passenger capacity was lowered. I hope this all makes sense to people in the audience. Now, all this technical stuff that I'm explaining to you doesn't really matter in history because we all know the horrific end result. That Titanic sank with a horrific loss of life. 1,496 men, women, and children died. There were an extra, maybe almost 500 seats that went unused during the evacuation of the Titanic. And because of the Titanic, and only because of the Titanic, the philosophy around lifeboats has completely changed forever. You will never, ever, ever again, because of Titanic, hear someone say that we don't need enough lifeboats for every single person. All of the arguments that were made prior to Titanic sinking were washed away once the Titanic plunged into the North Atlantic Ocean. You just couldn't make that argument anymore. Because if the Lusitania had struck an iceberg and sank, or the Mauritania had struck an iceberg and sank, or even the Olympic had struck an iceberg and sank, it would have been horrific, but I don't think it would have made a difference. There's something about Titanic, just her name and certain things, and the Greek mythology surrounding the naming of these three giant ocean liners that were basically the size of maybe almost 100-story building on its side. You just couldn't make those arguments anymore. It was impossible for any logical human being to make that argument that you don't need enough lifeboats for every single person on board. So I hope I have explained the lifeboat situation as clearly as I possibly can explain it. I'm going to do a part 2 video, and this is going to be part 2 about the lifeboat situation, and this is going to specifically focus on the situation involving people on the Titanic the night of her sinking. So stay tuned.